Worst prison food in the UK. Shocking secrets from British prisons. The rotten start. If you think prison life is just about cells and guards, wait until you see what's served on the plate. Hit subscribe if you want to uncover the hidden horrors behind Britain's prison kitchens. It was early morning in HMP Liverpool, and the cold steel corridors hummed with fluorescent lights. The inmates were already stirring, some still groggy from the night's restless sleep on thin mattresses, others alert, waiting for the clatter of metal trays to signal the start of breakfast. In the small, white-tiled kitchen at the heart of the prison, the smell of reheated stew mixed with a faint scent of disinfectant, a combination both familiar and unsettling. Inspectors had been warned about the conditions here for years. Broken equipment, peeling paint, and in some corners, a persistent layer of mold that refused to be cleaned. Yet, despite repeated reports, meals continued to arrive at the wings, delivered in cold, plastic trays. The morning routine was mechanical. Guards moved along the corridors, keys jangling, keeping a watchful eye on each inmate. For many prisoners, breakfast was a moment of both anticipation and dread. The porridge, often lumpy and watery, slid across the trays with a consistency somewhere between glue and soup. "It tastes like old water," one inmate later told an undercover journalist, insisting on anonymity. According to reports from Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons, similar complaints had been documented for years. Some inmates refused to eat altogether, citing both hygiene concerns and a deep sense of demoralization. Food, they said, had become less about nutrition and more about a tool of control, an extension of punishment beyond the bars. Meanwhile, in the administrative wing, prison management defended the operations. Budgets had been slashed over the past decade as austerity measures swept through local government departments. Kitchen staff were overworked, sometimes undertrained, and facilities were outdated. Food safety inspections were sporadic, and when they occurred, they often highlighted a recurring list of minor infractions that had become normalized. Yet the consequences were real. Tray after tray of meals delivered past expiration, frozen casseroles reheated multiple times, and stews containing meat that, according to reports, had been questioned for quality. The juxtaposition was stark. In a country with one of the most developed welfare systems in the world, inmates subsisted on meals that were barely edible. In one wing, the afternoon shift began preparing lunch. Staff moved briskly, attempting to compensate for the overcrowding that plagued the prison. HMP Liverpool, like many other UK facilities, operated well beyond its intended capacity, housing 1,200 inmates in spaces built for 800. Crowding meant that the kitchen had to produce meals at scale, often sacrificing quality for quantity. Behind the scenes, trays were stacked in metal racks, some still carrying bits of breakfast porridge from earlier, before being sent down the conveyor line to be heated in bulk ovens. The machinery groaned under the weight, and a sense of inevitability hung in the air. These were not gourmet kitchens. These were industrial food factories, where corners were cut, and human dignity was an afterthought. Reports from the prisons and probation ombudsman corroborated this grim picture. Inspectors frequently documented cases of mold in storage areas, expired sauces, and reheated frozen dinners served as nutrition. In interviews, former inmates described week-long rotations of the same bland meals, where variety was a fantasy. In one particularly harrowing account, an inmate recalled finding maggots in what was supposed to be a chicken casserole. While unverified officially, the account was consistent with multiple testimonies collected over several years. Nutritionists reviewing the menus noted that calorie counts were adequate, but the meals were largely devoid of essential nutrients and protein sources, leaving inmates malnourished despite regular portions. Yet it wasn't just the food itself. The environment amplified the psychological impact. Prisoners ate in communal halls where long tables were lined with chipped trays, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The noise of trays scraping metal against concrete, the smell of disinfectant mixed with stale food, and the knowledge that the meal in front of you had likely been sitting in a refrigerator too long created a sense of anxiety and disgust. Some inmates described waiting for seconds or skipping meals entirely as acts of small resistance, asserting control over a system designed to diminish their autonomy. Staff, aware of complaints but constrained by policy, often shrugged off concerns as minor or exaggerated. The inspector's reports also highlighted administrative blind spot. Health and safety protocols were in place on paper, but enforcement lagged. The kitchen staff were largely overworked, handling hundreds of meals daily with minimal break. In some prisons, staff shortages meant that inmates were drafted to assist in kitchen duties, further blurring the lines between punishment and routine labor. Food, which should have been a basic right, became an instrument of discipline, its inadequacy reflecting the broader pressures of austerity and overcrowding within the British prison system. In HMP Birmingham, the situation was similarly dire. One undercover investigation revealed freezer units failing to maintain correct temperatures, meaning meat portions thawed and refroze multiple times before serving. Lumpy mashed potatoes were a recurring complaint, and porridge, delivered in bulk, was described by one prisoner as water with oats. Unconfirmed reports suggested that some prisoners attempted to supplement their diets by trading with each other or even creating makeshift meals from commissary items. For many, survival became as much about navigating the food system as avoiding conflicts within the wings. Meanwhile, in official statements, prison authorities defended the operations, citing compliance with national standards and budgetary constraints. Yet these assurances did little to quell the growing unrest among inmates and advocacy groups. Organizations like the Howard League for Penal Reform and the Prisoners' Advice Service had repeatedly called attention to these conditions, emphasizing that food should not be used as an implicit form of punishment. The stark contrast between policy and practice became evident in documented inspections and media reports, creating a narrative that was both shocking and deeply human, a system in which meals, meant to sustain, often ended up demoralizing. As the morning progressed, the tension in the halls of HMP Liverpool mirrored a broader systemic issue. The physical presence of inadequate food was a daily reminder of control, austerity, and institutional neglect. Meals were distributed, trays returned, and the cycle continued. Yet, even in these grim circumstances, prisoners found ways to assert small forms of autonomy, skipping a meal, swapping items, or collectively complaining to inspectors. These small acts, seemingly mundane, highlighted the resilience of human dignity in the face of systemic neglect. By midday, the kitchen staff prepared the next round of trays for lunch, aware of the scrutiny from inspectors and the mounting complaints. The stainless steel surfaces were cleaned quickly, ovens heated, and the process repeated with precision and monotony. Despite their best efforts, structural problems, overcrowding, budget cuts, and outdated facilities limited what could be achieved. For inmates, each meal was not just food, it was a tangible representation of the prison's priorities and, in many cases, its failures. The day ended with trays returned, leftover meals discarded, and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights filling the empty dining halls. Behind the walls, reports would later confirm mold, undercooked meals, and repeated hygiene violations. Interviews with former inmates would describe the psychological toll: nausea, fatigue, and a sense of being punished beyond confinement. The British prison system, often regarded as advanced and humane, had, in its food provision, created a layer of suffering that was rarely visible to the public eye. The first chapter closes with an inspector stepping into the kitchen late in the evening, clipboard in hand. He observes trays stacked, food cooled, and the hum of freezers in the background. In one corner, a lumpy, grayish porridge sits untouched, a silent testament to the ongoing neglect. According to reports, this was not an isolated case. similar conditions persisted across multiple prisons in the country. The unconfirmed accounts of spoiled food, mold, and undernutrition lingered in the margins of official records, a quiet but persistent scandal awaiting deeper investigation. Behind the kitchen doors. Morning broke over HMP Liverpool again, but unlike the previous day, the focus shifted from the inmates' immediate experience of poor food to the unseen machinery that produced it. Behind the heavy steel doors of the kitchen, the environment was a labyrinth of stainless steel counters, industrial ovens, and metal racks stacked with trays waiting to be filled. The kitchens were far from luxurious. Many of the appliances were decades old, prone to breakdowns, and barely sufficient for the number of meals required daily. Inspectors' reports over the years repeatedly highlighted faulty ovens, malfunctioning freezers, and peeling tiles in workspaces where hygiene standards were difficult to enforce. The systemic pressures were immediately apparent. Budget cuts and austerity measures imposed by the Ministry of Justice had forced many prisons to operate on reduced food budget. HMP Liverpool, like many others, had to feed over 1,000 inmates with resources intended for far fewer. Food procurement relied heavily on bulk orders of frozen or prepackaged meals, and fresh produce was often a rarity. Staff shortages meant that each kitchen team had to move at a relentless pace, with minimal breaks and constant pressure to deliver hundreds of trays in tight time frames. News reports from the Howard League for Penal Reform indicated that such staffing constraints often led to lapses in food preparation and quality control, a direct consequence of systemic underfunding rather than individual negligence. Interviews with former kitchen staff, documented in various oversight reports, revealed the personal toll of these conditions. "You try to do your best," said one former cook, requesting anonymity, "but when you're running an operation that size, with broken equipment and half the team missing, mistakes happen. Sometimes it's moldy vegetables, sometimes meat that's been in the freezer too long. You know it's not ideal, but what can you do?" These statements, corroborated by multiple reports and anonymous staff testimonies, illustrated a system under duress, a chain of accountability that stretched from policymakers down to overworked kitchen workers. Meanwhile, the impact on inmates was far-reaching. Nutritionists reviewing prison menus, including those published by the Ministry of Justice, noted that while calorie content was generally sufficient, the quality and variety were severely lacking. Protein sources were minimal, vegetables overcooked, and meals often repeated day after day. In interviews cited by national newspapers, prisoners reported experiencing fatigue, digestive issues, and chronic dissatisfaction with the food provided. For some, the lack of palatable, nutritious meals exacerbated existing tensions within the wings, contributing indirectly to behavioral issues and conflict. The systemic issues were compounded by logistical challenges. Delivery schedules for bulk food were sometimes delayed, resulting in reheated leftovers or reliance on long-life frozen meals. Storage areas, particularly for perishable items, were often overcrowded, increasing the risk of spoilage. According to reports from the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman, inspectors found instances where meat and dairy products were past their use-by dates, though these were not widespread, and prison management often corrected issues swiftly when identified. Nevertheless, the repeated occurrence of these lapses over years demonstrated that the problem was embedded in operational structures rather than isolated incident. Staff perspectives offered additional insight. Many kitchen employees described working under constant scrutiny from both inspectors and prison administration. Rules for hygiene and food safety were stringent on paper but difficult to enforce in practice. For instance, one report highlighted that freezer temperatures were monitored daily, yet the combination of high volume, outdated equipment, and human error meant that some food inevitably fell below recommended storage temperatures. Staff interviews indicated that training was often minimal, leaving workers ill-equipped to handle the complexity and scale of meal preparation required. Amidst these challenges, inmates had developed coping strategies. Some would trade commissary items or snacks to supplement insufficient meals. Others created makeshift dishes from available ingredients, turning boiled potatoes or bread into slightly more palatable substitute. These adaptations, documented in several investigative reports and prisoner interviews, reflected a subtle form of resistance, a way to reclaim control in a system designed to strip autonomy. While these measures could not replace proper nutrition, they highlighted the ingenuity and resilience of prisoners facing systemic neglect. Across the UK, conditions varied between institutions but shared common trends. HMP Birmingham, HMP Wandsworth, and HMP Manchester were repeatedly cited in news reports for similar issues: underfunded kitchens, repetitive menus, and high workloads for staff. Some inspectors suggested that austerity measures, combined with overcrowding, were the root cause of the problem rather than deliberate mistreatment. Nevertheless, the lived experience for inmates, watery stews, overcooked vegetables, and minimal protein, was undeniable. In one widely reported case, an inspection at HMP Birmingham in 2018 revealed frozen meals reheated multiple times, with mold detected on a small number of stored vegetables, illustrating the persistence of these systemic issues. By mid-afternoon at HMP Liverpool, lunch was underway. Trays clattered as they were distributed down narrow corridors, the smell of stews and reheated casseroles mixing with the metallic scent of prison infrastructure. Staff monitored intake, while inmates quietly assessed the condition of each meal. For some, lunch was skipped entirely; for others, it was a test of endurance. What became increasingly clear from reports and interviews was that these meals were not merely sustenance, they were a reflection of broader institutional pressures, a mirror of austerity, overcrowding, and under-resourcing that had been quietly building over years. As the day wound down, inspectors returned to review logs, temperature charts, and maintenance records. They noted repeated minor infractions, gaps in training, and occasional lapses in hygiene protocols. Yet the larger systemic issues, overcrowding, budget constraints, and aging infrastructure, remained unresolved. Inmates, staff, and inspectors alike navigated a delicate balance, delivering and consuming meals that were often substandard while maintaining daily operations and safety. The implications of this delicate equilibrium were profound, influencing health, morale, and the very fabric of daily life behind bars. The chapter closes with a chilling observation. Despite reforms promised by the Ministry of Justice, including new menus and kitchen upgrades in select facilities, reports indicated that many inmates continued to receive meals that were nutritionally insufficient, unappetizing, or prepared under suboptimal conditions. One former prisoner described the experience as punishment disguised as food, a sentiment echoed in multiple interviews and independent investigations. For the British prison system, the challenge was not merely feeding inmates, but confronting the structural failings that had allowed poor nutrition and systemic neglect to persist for decades. Reports, inspections, and the toll on health. The morning light filtered into HMP Birmingham through small, barred windows, casting long, cold shadows across the kitchen and dining hall. Inspectors from Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons were already at work, clipboard in hand, reviewing logbooks, temperature charts, and staff reports. Over the past decade, HMP Birmingham had repeatedly been cited for poor food quality, yet the cycle of complaints continued unabated. According to their 2018 inspection report, several freezers were operating below recommended temperatures, meat was being reheated multiple times, and some vegetables showed early signs of spoilage. The inspector's notes read like a litany of repeated oversights: equipment past its service date, understaffed kitchens, and insufficient training for food handling staff. Inmates waiting for breakfast offered a starkly different perspective. "It's barely food," one prisoner said during an undercover investigation, his voice hushed. "Most days, it's just something to keep your stomach from growling." According to reports in The Guardian and the Howard League for Penal Reform, similar complaints were documented across multiple prisons: HMP Wandsworth, HMP Manchester, and HMP Liverpool. Meals consisted of watery stews, lumpy porridge, and reheated frozen dinners that were meant to provide nutrition but often left prisoners undernourished. Recurrent menus, lack of fresh vegetables, and low-protein options meant that, even when calorie counts were met, inmates were missing key nutrients for sustained health. HMP Wandsworth, one of the largest prisons in the UK, was a particularly stark example. In a 2019 inspection, reports highlighted the repetitive nature of meals and frequent use of prepackaged food. Inmates interviewed by inspectors described long-term fatigue, digestive issues, and diminished morale. Nutritionists reviewing menus confirmed that although energy needs were technically met, the quality of proteins, fiber, and essential vitamins was inadequate. Chronic undernutrition was a consistent theme. For elderly or medically vulnerable prisoners, the effects were particularly acute, increasing susceptibility to illness and slowing recovery from minor health issues. Behind the kitchens, staff faced immense pressure. According to interviews with former kitchen employees, some shifts ran with less than half the recommended number of staff, forcing workers to multitask under stressful conditions. One anonymous former cook noted, "We tried to follow the recipes, but with the number of trays, the broken ovens, and the lack of helpers, shortcuts were inevitable." It wasn't about negligence, it was about survival. These first-hand accounts were corroborated by inspector notes, which documented the impossibility of maintaining hygiene standards and meal quality under such conditions. At HMP Manchester, inspectors reported another recurring problem: the storage of bulk ingredients in overcrowded freezers and pantries. Meat, dairy, and vegetables were frequently stored for days beyond ideal usage periods, sometimes frozen and refrozen, which compromised quality. Food safety protocols existed on paper, but enforcement lagged due to operational demands and staffing shortages. Multiple inmates recounted instances of food being served cold, undercooked, or stale, experiences confirmed by undercover investigations published in national newspapers. Health impacts were visible beyond anecdotal account. Medical staff in several prisons reported a rise in digestive complaints, vitamin deficiencies, and fatigue-related issues among inmates. According to a 2020 report by the Penal Reform Trust, repeated exposure to inadequate diets exacerbated chronic conditions and weakened immune responses. Inspectors also noted psychological effects: diminished morale, complaints of dehumanization, and heightened tensions during meal times. Food had become a symbol of institutional neglect, a daily reminder of overcrowding and austerity measures that stripped prisoners of basic dignity. The human cost was not limited to physical or psychological effect. Inmates often attempted to supplement their meals through commissary items, trades with fellow prisoners, or even scavenging for edible items discarded by the kitchen. While these strategies offered some temporary relief, they were not solutions. Reports consistently noted that these coping mechanisms could reinforce social hierarchies within the prison wings, with inmates controlling access to extra food exerting influence over others. Inspectors also observed that repetitive menus contributed to a form of learned helplessness. Prisoners reported that no matter what they requested or complained about, the food rarely changed. Even when improvements were announced, such as the introduction of fresh vegetables or protein-rich options, logistical failures and budgetary constraints meant that promised upgrades often arrived late or inconsistently. The result was an environment in which the meal system itself contributed to demoralization, echoing the broader systemic issues in UK prisons: overcrowding, budget cuts, aging infrastructure, and undertrained staff. Across multiple prisons, a common theme emerged: kitchens were operating under conditions that compromised both quality and safety, yet the responsibility for these deficiencies was diffused across multiple layers of management. Prison governors, administrative staff, kitchen managers, and policymakers each shared accountability, yet no single solution had been successfully implemented. Investigative reports highlighted that systemic reforms, rather than minor procedural changes, were necessary to address chronic undernutrition and poor food quality. By evening, as the final trays of dinner were delivered, the persistent challenges of the day were apparent. Trays of reheated stews, overcooked vegetables, and processed protein substitutes were returned with little enthusiasm. Inmates, staff, and inspectors alike understood that the cycle would repeat. The systemic issues, underfunding, overcrowding, and outdated facilities, would remain, ensuring that food continued to be more punishment than nourishment. A lone inspector, leaving the kitchen, glanced at a tray of lumpy porridge left uneaten, a quiet testament to the enduring failure of a system that was meant to uphold human dignity even behind bars. The chapter closes with a chilling, unconfirmed observation. Multiple anonymous inmates hinted at the creative ways some staff attempted to stretch limited resources, reusing sauces, extending shelf life of proteins, and repurposing leftover meals. While these practices were largely undocumented and labeled unverified in official reports, they pointed to a deeper truth. A system under immense pressure, where human ingenuity was applied not to improve meals but to simply meet operational demands. The system behind the tray. The cold metal doors of HMP Wandsworth clanged shut as inspectors stepped into the administrative wing, papers and reports in hand. Beyond the smell of disinfectant and reheated meals, the story of Britain's prison food was not just about what ended up on inmates' plates. It was about decades of policy decisions, budget allocations, and systemic pressures that had shaped the way food was produced and distributed across the prison estate. According to reports from the Penal Reform Trust and parliamentary committees, austerity measures had drastically reduced the funding available for prison kitchens, while population pressures, prisons consistently operating at 110 to 120% capacity, forced staff to focus on quantity over quality. In interviews conducted by Inspectorate of Prisons, former kitchen staff consistently cited budget constraints as the root cause of poor meals. Bulk procurement of frozen or pre-packaged foods, while cost-effective, often came at the expense of freshness and nutritional value. Managers admitted that in order to meet the dietary standards on paper, compromises were made on taste, variety, and presentation. One staff member, speaking anonymously, explained, "We were given a fixed budget, and we had to feed hundreds every day. Fresh meat and vegetables were too expensive. We had to rely on frozen and tinned food. It wasn't ideal, but it was all we could do." These statements were backed up in multiple inspector reports and parliamentary oversight hearings. Government policy, too, played a significant role. The Ministry of Justice had mandated cost-saving measures across the prison estate as part of broader austerity initiatives in the early 2010s. Prisons were encouraged to minimize expenditures while maintaining compliance with basic nutrition standards. As a result, menus became formulaic, relying heavily on cheap, processed ingredients. Health inspectors noted that meals technically met calorie requirements but failed to deliver sufficient protein, vitamins, or fresh produce. Inmates, staff, and advocacy groups alike reported that these measures effectively turned meals into a form of secondary punishment, a reduction in dignity that was systemic rather than incidental. Overcrowding amplified the problem. HMP Birmingham and HMP Manchester, for example, were consistently housing more inmates than their design capacity. Kitchens had to produce hundreds of additional meals daily, often under intense time pressure and with limited equipment. Inspectors repeatedly noted that staff shortages, combined with outdated ovens and fridges, led to repeated errors. Undercooked proteins, lumpy porridge, and reheated stews served multiple times. While the Ministry of Justice emphasized compliance with food safety regulations, the reality on the ground told a different story. one in which systemic inefficiencies outweighed policy intentions. Operational mismanagement further compounded the issue. Reports from the Prison Service Ombudsman highlighted inconsistencies in staff training and adherence to food hygiene protocols. In some facilities, kitchen staff received only minimal instruction in large-scale food preparation, leaving room for errors and oversight. Combined with the logistical complexity of serving meals on time across multiple wings, the system was vulnerable to repeated failures. Inmates reported frequent delays, missing portions, and meals arriving cold or spoiled. These experiences were echoed in undercover journalistic investigations, confirming that the problem extended far beyond individual kitchens. Health consequences for inmates were documented in medical and inspector reports. Chronic fatigue, digestive complaints, and nutrient deficiencies were common in institutions relying heavily on processed or reheated food. In one inspection report from HMP Liverpool, medical staff noted a notable increase in vitamin deficiencies and gastrointestinal problems among long-term prisoners. Nutritionists reviewing menus concluded that while caloric intake met minimum standards, essential nutrients were often lacking, a shortfall that disproportionately affected vulnerable populations, including the elderly and medically fragile. The austerity-driven constraints also influenced procurement practices. Bulk contracts favored large suppliers capable of providing prepackaged or frozen meals at low cost. This reduced operational flexibility, leaving prison kitchens unable to source fresh or high-quality ingredients. Inspectors noted that some facilities attempted workarounds, using seasonal vegetables or purchasing small quantities of fresh protein, but these efforts were inconsistent and often undone by larger systemic pressures. Meanwhile, staff morale was affected by the tension between policy expectations and operational realities. Kitchen teams were often blamed for the inadequacy of meals, despite systemic constraints outside their control. This created a stressful environment in which staff were caught between administrative oversight, resource limitations, and the immediate needs of hundreds of inmates. In interviews cited by Inspectorate, staff described the psychological toll. "We know the meals aren't good enough, but we can't do more with what we've got. You feel like you're letting everyone down every day." Austerity and mismanagement had ripple effects beyond food quality. Inspectors observed that dissatisfaction with meals often exacerbated tensions in wings, contributing to conflicts among inmates and between inmates and staff. Reports cited multiple incidents in HMP Manchester and HMP Birmingham where disputes during mealtimes escalated into altercations. While these were not direct consequences of the food itself, the poor quality and repetitive menus created a persistent source of frustration, compounding the daily stress of prison life. By evening, as the last trays of dinner were served, the broader systemic picture became starkly visible. Overcrowded wings, outdated kitchens, understaffed teams, and austerity-driven policies combined to create an environment where food was not just inadequate but emblematic of institutional neglect. Inspectors concluded that piecemeal solutions, minor kitchen repairs, additional staff for a single week, or temporary menu changes, could not resolve the problem. Only a comprehensive review of funding, infrastructure, and operational strategy could address the persistent nutritional shortcomings in Britain's prisons. The chapter closes with an ominous insight from a senior inspector. Despite repeated reports and public scrutiny, many of the issues persisted across multiple institutions. Trays of watery stews, lumpy porridge, and reheated frozen meals were still being served, leaving inmates with the daily reminder that austerity and mismanagement had tangible consequences on their health, morale, and dignity. For the British prison system, the challenge was no longer about compliance on paper. It was about confronting decades of systemic failure. Faces behind the trays. The clatter of metal trays echoed through the corridors of HMP Liverpool as lunchtime approached. For many inmates, it was a familiar ritual, shuffled along the narrow corridors, seated at long, metal tables, and confronted with meals that were at best bland, at worst unpalatable. Yet beyond the texture, taste, and temperature, these trays represented something far deeper, a tangible reminder of a system that often seemed indifferent to the human beings it held captive. Interviews documented by the Howard League for Penal Reform, along with undercover reporting from The Guardian and BBC Investigations, revealed that prisoners internalized the poor quality of food as a reflection of their own worth. John, a pseudonym used to protect the identity of a long-term inmate at HMP Birmingham, described his daily ordeal. "You're served this watery stew and lumpy porridge every day. It's not just about being hungry. It's about being ignored. They don't even try." According to the 2018 inspection report, complaints like John's were common. Staff acknowledged that, while meals met caloric standards, nutritional deficiencies and monotonous menus left inmates fatigued and frustrated. Beyond physical effects, mental health consequences were substantial. Prisoners frequently reported depression, anxiety, and a sense of helplessness, a phenomenon inspectors referred to as institutional demoralization. The repetitive, low-quality meals became a daily stressor, contributing to tension within wings and straining relationships among inmates. At HMP Wandsworth, an undercover investigation highlighted similar experiences. Prisoners described the lengths to which they went to supplement their diets, exchanging commissary items, pooling resources to make small, enhanced meals, or scavenging leftover food when permitted. While such actions occasionally provided temporary relief, they also reinforced social hierarchies within the prison. Those with access to commissary items or additional resources exerted subtle power over others, determining who could improve their meals and who could not. Nutritionists reviewing these practices noted that these survival strategies, while creative, did little to compensate for systemic undernutrition, particularly in vulnerable populations such as elderly inmates or those with chronic health conditions. Medical staff in multiple prisons confirmed the physical impact of poor diet. According to the Prison Reform Trust and NHS reports, inmates displayed symptoms consistent with insufficient protein intake, vitamin deficiencies, and weakened immune systems. Digestive issues were commonplace, exacerbated by reliance on processed, reheated meals. One physician at HMP Manchester noted, "The caloric content may technically meet requirements, but the lack of fresh produce, fiber, and quality protein has measurable health consequences. Inmates get tired more easily, recover from illness more slowly, and chronic conditions worsen." These observations were consistent across multiple facilities, including HMP Birmingham, HMP Liverpool, and HMP Manchester, forming a pattern that could not be dismissed as anecdotal. Psychological impacts were equally profound. Inmates described feelings of humiliation and dehumanization. "It's like the food is a punishment," a former prisoner at HMP Birmingham told BBC investigators. "They could feed us properly, but they don't. You start to feel invisible." Reports confirmed that this perception contributed to low morale, agitation, and sometimes violence within wings. Guards and staff, aware of these tensions, often attempted to mediate, but the underlying structural issues, overcrowding, austerity, and outdated kitchen facilities, left little room for meaningful intervention. The daily routine of eating under these conditions also had social consequences. Meals became a point of both tension and negotiation. Prisoners who could improvise or enhance their trays with commissary items were viewed as resourceful, while those unable to supplement their meals often experienced social marginalization. Interviews documented in Inspectorate reports emphasized that these dynamics were not trivial. They shaped relationships, hierarchies, and even minor conflicts within wings. Nutrition, in this sense, became a currency of social control, exacerbating stress and fostering resentment. Despite these harsh realities, some inmates found resilience in routine. The act of sharing, bargaining, or preparing small supplemental meals became a way to reclaim agency. According to investigative reporting, groups of prisoners would pool their resources to create modest improvements to bland meals. A bit of canned tuna here, a spoon of sugar there, small acts that reminded them they retained some control over their environment. While these practices did not solve the systemic issues, they demonstrated human ingenuity and adaptability in conditions of constraint. In HMP Liverpool, inspectors noted that inmate complaints regarding nutrition were consistent over years, and yet systemic improvements were slow. Reports recommended increased budget allocations, improved kitchen infrastructure, and expanded training for staff. However, budget pressures and operational demands continued to limit the implementation of these recommendations. Former inmates described this gap between policy and practice as a source of ongoing frustration, knowing that better meals were possible, yet repeatedly receiving inadequate sustenance, deepened feelings of neglect and demoralization. The chapter also highlighted individual stories of health crises exacerbated by poor diet. In one widely reported case at HMP Birmingham, an elderly inmate experienced severe vitamin deficiency, contributing to chronic fatigue and impaired immunity. While the prison's medical team intervened, the situation underscored the cumulative consequences of a diet consistently lacking in essential nutrients. Similar accounts were reported across other facilities, emphasizing that the issue extended beyond inconvenience or discomfort. It directly affected inmate well-being. By evening, as trays were cleared and the echoes of metal clattering faded, the invisible toll of poor nutrition was clear. Inmates retreated to cells, some with stomachs only partially satisfied, others grappling with fatigue or frustration. Medical staff and inspectors quietly documented their findings, knowing that the issue was not isolated to a single meal or kitchen, but embedded in a system under financial and operational strain. The human stories behind each tray of lumpy porridge or reheated stew painted a picture of resilience in the face of neglect, but also of enduring institutional failure. The chapter closes with a sobering thought from a former inmate interviewed anonymously. You survive in here by learning to adapt, by making small choices where you can. But every day, the food reminds you, the system doesn't care. And when the system doesn't care, it affects everything: your body, your mind, your spirit. Scrutiny and reform. By mid-morning at HMP Manchester, the corridors felt different. Inspectors from Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons and representatives from the Prison Reform Trust were present, clipboard and cameras in hand. The atmosphere was tense. Staff knew they were under scrutiny, and inmates sensed the unusual activity. Over the past decade, multiple reports had highlighted systemic deficiencies in food provision, but official attention rarely translated into long-term improvements. Today, however, the focus was on accountability, understanding why decades of repeated failures had persisted, and exploring possible reforms. The inspection team began in the kitchen, noting the layout, staff allocation, and workflow. According to their reports, staff shortages, outdated equipment, and the sheer volume of meals remained primary obstacles. While minor repairs had been undertaken, a new oven here, a refurbished freezer there, these incremental improvements did little to address structural issues. The inspectors also reviewed procurement policies. Budgets for food were constrained by austerity measures, meaning kitchens relied heavily on frozen or prepackaged meals. Reports from the Ministry of Justice confirmed that cost-cutting pressures had intensified in the early 2010s, reducing flexibility and limiting access to fresh, nutrient-rich ingredients. Reform proposals had been circulating for years. Recommendations included increasing kitchen budgets, expanding staff training, introducing varied menus with higher quality protein and vegetables, and modernizing cooking facilities. In some prisons, pilot programs had been attempted, HMP Birmingham, for instance, experimented with weekly deliveries of fresh produce and small rotations of more diverse meals. However, these initiatives were often inconsistent, with logistical challenges, limited funding, and competing operational priorities undermining sustained progress. News articles and parliamentary reports highlighted that while pilot schemes were well received by inmates, they were rarely scaled across the prison estate. Public attention had occasionally spurred change. In 2018, a BBC Panorama investigation documented widespread dissatisfaction with prison food in England and Wales. It featured interviews with anonymous inmates describing moldy vegetables, tasteless stews, and repeated reheating of meals. The coverage prompted statements from the Ministry of Justice promising reviews and targeted reforms, including increased oversight of kitchens, better staff training, and improvements in food storage. Follow-up reports, however, indicated that while procedures had improved in some areas, the underlying systemic issues, austerity, overcrowding, and aging infrastructure, remained largely unresolved. Inspectors also examined health records. Chronic fatigue, digestive issues, and deficiencies in essential nutrients continued to be reported among long-term inmates. Medical teams across multiple facilities emphasized that while calorie intake often met minimum standards, the quality of food was inadequate for maintaining optimal health. According to the 2020 Prison Reform Trust report, elderly prisoners and those with chronic illnesses were particularly affected, highlighting the intersection of systemic failings and vulnerability. Accountability was another focus. Kitchen staff were rarely blamed individually. Inspectors noted that operational constraints left them with little room to improve outcomes. Responsibility often fell to governors and policymakers who had to balance food budgets against wider operational costs. Parliamentary committees reviewing the prison estate repeatedly recommended long-term funding increases and improved staff-to-inmate ratios, yet political priorities and economic pressures delayed substantial action. Advocacy groups emphasized that without systemic investment, the cycle of inadequate meals and compromised nutrition would persist. Inmates themselves played a crucial role in exposing systemic issues. Anonymous interviews collected over several years revealed that prisoners regularly reported problems through formal complaint channels. These complaints included spoiled food, undercooked meals, and the psychological effects of repetitive menus. While some prisons responded promptly, many reports languished, and repeated complaints were a common theme in inspector evaluations. The message was clear. The problem was recognized at multiple levels, but enduring reform had been slow to materialize. In HMP Liverpool, inspectors observed creative solutions implemented by staff and inmates to mitigate the problem. Staff sometimes prioritized preparation of higher quality meals for vulnerable populations, such as elderly or medically fragile prisoners. Inmates continued to supplement their diets with commissary items and trades, illustrating adaptive resilience. While these measures offered temporary relief, they underscored the broader failure. Systemic pressures prevented consistent delivery of adequate nutrition. Policy debates reached the national stage in the late 2010s. Parliamentary hearings, media reports, and advocacy campaigns highlighted that food quality was not merely a matter of taste or comfort but of health, dignity, and human rights. The Howard League for Penal Reform and other organizations emphasized that providing nutritious, palatable meals was an essential component of humane treatment. Recommendations included revisiting procurement policies, modernizing kitchen facilities, and ensuring that food budgets reflected actual operational needs, not austerity-driven assumptions. By late afternoon, as inspectors concluded their review, the challenge became evident. While localized improvements and pilot schemes offered hope, the structural constraints of budget limitations, overcrowding, and outdated infrastructure remained. The system had acknowledged failures repeatedly, yet the implementation of reforms was patchy at best. Inmates' daily experience, watery stews, lumpy porridge, and repeated reheated meals, persisted despite public scrutiny and repeated recommendations. The chapter closes on a sobering note. Even when reforms were proposed and partially implemented, the deeply embedded structural issues within the UK prison system meant that many inmates continued to suffer the consequences of inadequate nutrition. One inspector, departing HMP Birmingham, noted quietly, "You can tweak menus, refurbish ovens, or add fresh vegetables for a week. But until funding, staffing, and overcrowding are addressed, these failures will repeat themselves, and the people most affected will always be the inmates." Resilience behind bars. The dim fluorescent lights flickered over the wings of HMP Birmingham as evening settled in. The hum of prison life continued, clattering trays, distant shouts, and the metallic scrape of locks, yet within these walls, a quieter, more resilient story was unfolding. Inmates had long learned to navigate the systemic inadequacies of their environment, particularly when it came to meals. Food, inadequate as it was, had become a symbol of both neglect and ingenuity. Those who endured and adapted revealed the human capacity to reclaim control in circumstances designed to strip it away. Interviews collected by advocacy groups like the Howard League for Penal Reform highlighted the subtle yet significant ways prisoners coped with poor nutrition. Some pooled commissary items to improve meals, creating small communal efforts to add flavor or protein. Others exchanged goods within wings, leveraging limited resources to ensure that the most vulnerable, the elderly, infirm, or newly admitted, could access slightly better options. While these practices were not substitutes for proper nutrition, they illustrated resilience and community building in a system largely indifferent to individual welfare. Medical staff corroborated the ingenuity and necessity of these coping strategies. Reports indicated that prisoners who were proactive in supplementing their diets, even modestly, often experienced fewer health complications associated with nutrient deficiencies. Nutritionists reviewing prison menus noted that small adjustments, a can of tuna here, a few extra vegetables there, could significantly impact well-being, particularly for those most at risk. Yet these small victories remained overshadowed by the systemic failures. Budget constraints, overcrowding, and aging kitchen infrastructure meant that such solutions were inconsistent and relied heavily on inmate initiative. Advocacy groups played a critical role in both documenting these conditions and pushing for reform. The Howard League, Prison Reform Trust, and other organizations regularly submitted reports to Inspectorate of Prisons, highlighting the ongoing inadequacies of meals, hygiene, and nutrition. Public attention occasionally resulted in temporary improvements, pilot programs introducing fresh produce, menu diversification, or upgraded kitchen equipment. However, these measures were often short-lived, hampered by broader systemic limitations. Parliamentary debates reflected this tension, emphasizing the moral and legal obligation to ensure adequate nutrition while simultaneously navigating austerity measures and operational budget. Inmates described psychological adaptations as well. Knowing that meals were unlikely to improve, many reframed the daily routine to preserve dignity and morale. Simple rituals, preparing personal supplements, sharing items with trusted peers, or focusing on portioning meals strategically, became methods to maintain a sense of agency. These practices were documented in multiple inspector reports and interviews with former prisoners. The strategies, while subtle, underscored an important principle: even within a system designed to constrain, human beings find ways to assert autonomy and resilience. HMP Liverpool, frequently cited for repeated nutritional deficiencies, offered a particularly vivid example. Inmates created informal kitchen committees, sharing tips for reheating or enhancing standard meals, advising newcomers on how to survive on the available menus, and collectively mitigating the worst effects of systemic shortcomings. According to unconfirmed reports collected anonymously, These groups were not just survival mechanisms but also forms of social cohesion, fostering trust and cooperation in an environment otherwise defined by restriction and oversight. Inspectors noted that the ongoing advocacy efforts had begun to influence policy, albeit slowly. Recommendations for increased kitchen funding, staff training, and infrastructure upgrades were now taken more seriously, partly due to public scrutiny following investigative journalism and parliamentary inquiries. In 2020, pilot initiatives in several prisons introduced small but measurable improvements: fresher produce, expanded menu rotations, and better training for kitchen staff. Inmates and staff alike reported that these incremental changes, while insufficient to resolve systemic issues entirely, contributed to improved morale and slightly better nutritional outcomes. Yet the underlying structural challenges remained. Overcrowding, limited budgets, and aging facilities continued to constrain operations. Despite documented improvements in select institutions, reports consistently emphasized that consistent, long-term solutions were essential. Advocates argued that only by addressing root causes, underfunding, outdated procurement processes, and staff shortages, could inmates experience meals that met basic standards of nutrition and dignity. Until such reforms were fully implemented, resilience remained a necessary skill for survival, not a luxury. The chapter closes on a human note. In the dim light of a Liverpool cell, a small group of inmates shared a meal, combining commissary items with the standard tray to create a modest, more palatable dinner. Laughter and conversation punctuated the otherwise harsh environment, a quiet rebellion against the systemic failures surrounding them. For a moment, despite watery stews and lumpy porridge, dignity and agency were reclaimed, if only briefly. These small acts, documented across multiple institutions, reflected not only survival but also the enduring human spirit, a reminder that even in the face of systemic neglect, individuals find ways to persevere. The lasting toll. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the barred windows of HMP Birmingham, illuminating the narrow corridors where inmates shuffled toward the dining hall. For many, these corridors were more than a passage to a meal, they were a reminder of the enduring consequences of inadequate nutrition. Chronic exposure to watery stews, overcooked vegetables, and repetitive menus had tangible effects on both physical and mental health, documented repeatedly in inspector reports and medical assessments across the UK prison system. Medical evaluations in multiple prisons revealed patterns consistent with long-term nutritional deficit. According to the Penal Reform Trust, inmates frequently exhibited vitamin deficiencies, weakened immune responses, and digestive disorders. Elderly prisoners and those with pre-existing medical conditions were disproportionately affected, experiencing slower recovery from illness and heightened vulnerability to infections. In some cases, deficiencies contributed to fatigue, muscle weakness, and other physical symptoms that impacted daily life behind bars. These findings were corroborated by NHS-employed medical staff and prison healthcare reports, demonstrating that poor-quality meals were not just inconvenient but harmful over the long term. Beyond physical health, the psychological consequences were profound. Reports documented in Inspectorate of Prisons revealed that repetitive, unpalatable meals contributed to demoralization, anxiety, and even depression among inmates. One former prisoner at HMP Liverpool described the effect vividly. After weeks of the same bland food, you start to feel like your body doesn't matter. You eat just to survive, not to live. Such experiences were reinforced by interviews with multiple inmates across HMP Wandsworth, HMP Manchester, and HMP Birmingham, creating a pattern in which poor meals exacerbated stress, reduced morale, and intensified tensions within wings. Behavioral impacts were equally significant. Inspectors noted that dissatisfaction with meals sometimes contributed to minor conflicts and disputes during serving times. Reports highlighted that inmates often negotiated, traded, or competed for limited supplementary food items, creating subtle hierarchies within wings. In extreme cases, frustration over repeated dietary inadequacies intersected with existing tensions, occasionally escalating to altercations, though formal incidents were relatively rare compared with the broader population of complaints. The link between nutrition and behavior, while indirect, demonstrated how inadequate food could compound the challenges of prison management. Systemic lessons from these reports were clear. Investigations suggested that improving meal quality could have cascading benefits, from better physical health to improved mental well-being and reduced tension within wings. Parliamentary inquiries in the late 2010s emphasized that adequate nutrition was a legal and ethical obligation, not a luxury. The Ministry of Justice acknowledged the need for consistent funding, better infrastructure, and trained kitchen staff, yet budgetary pressures and austerity constraints continued to limit full implementation. Reports recommended reforms such as revising procurement policies to include fresh produce, diversifying menus to meet nutritional requirements, and improving staff-to-inmate ratios in kitchens. Some prisons began experimenting with solutions. Pilot programs introduced weekly fresh produce deliveries, menu rotations to reduce monotony, and specialized meals for vulnerable populations. At HMP Birmingham, a nutritionist-led initiative sought to adjust meals for older inmates and those with medical conditions, aiming to reduce deficiencies documented in prior inspections. While these interventions were promising, inspector reports repeatedly noted that they were inconsistent across the estate, leaving many inmates still subject to substandard meals. Inmates themselves continued to adapt. Sharing commissary items, pooling resources, and improvising meals remained essential strategies. According to investigative reporting and advocacy documentation, these practices mitigated but could not fully resolve the impact of inadequate institutional food. Long-term consequences persisted in health, morale, and resilience, a reminder that systemic issues, once entrenched, required sustained, large-scale intervention rather than ad hoc adjustments. Even after reforms, medical staff noted lingering effects from years of inadequate nutrition. Some long-term prisoners exhibited chronic fatigue, dental issues, and gastrointestinal problems, reflecting cumulative deficiencies. Psychologically, patterns of learned helplessness, low morale, and diminished trust in institutional care persisted. Inspectors concluded that while small improvements were achievable, the systemic neglect of nutrition over decades had left a lasting imprint on the inmate population, underscoring the profound human cost of austerity and mismanagement. By late afternoon, the corridors were quiet. Trays were cleared, kitchens emptied, and the day's rhythm slowed. Yet the imprint of poor nutrition lingered, visible in the health records, inspector notes, and the weary expressions of inmates. The chapter closes on a sobering insight. Nutrition is not merely sustenance. In prison, it is a lens into the system's values, priorities, and failures. The cumulative impact of repeated neglect was not just measured in hunger or fatigue, but in the ongoing physical and psychological toll on human lives confined within these walls. Spotlight on neglect. The buzz of fluorescent lights and the metallic clang of trays echoed through HMP Manchester as journalists from national media outlets quietly made their way through the corridors. Over the past decade, investigative reporting had increasingly shone a spotlight on prison food in the UK, exposing systemic failures that had long been documented in inspector reports but remained largely unseen by the public. BBC Panorama, The Guardian, and The Independent had all published stories revealing lumpy porridge, watery stews, and reheated frozen meals being served daily, a stark contrast to the expectations of a modern, developed penal system. In HMP Birmingham, undercover footage captured kitchens operating under extreme pressure, staff rushing to prepare hundreds of trays in minutes, ovens groaning under the weight of pre-packaged meals, and storage areas crowded with frozen, sometimes expired ingredients. According to news reports and Inspectorate records, these conditions were emblematic of a wider problem: austerity-driven budgets, overcrowding, and outdated infrastructure. The public reaction to these revelations was immediate. Advocacy groups, long highlighting systemic failures, found their campaigns amplified, forcing policymakers to acknowledge the human cost of poor nutrition behind bars. Organizations such as the Howard League for Penal Reform and the Prison Reform Trust leveraged these stories to push for reform. They documented case studies, collected inmate testimonies, and submitted detailed reports to Parliament. One report noted, "Nutrition in prisons is not merely a matter of sustenance. It is central to maintaining dignity, health, and humane conditions." Repeated failures in food provision reflect broader systemic neglect that must be addressed at policy level. Media coverage helped translate these reports into public discourse, increasing pressure on the Ministry of Justice to allocate funds, update procurement procedures, and improve kitchen facilities. The response from policymakers was measured but inconsistent. Parliamentary committees held hearings, questioning prison governors, Ministry of Justice officials, and inspectors about the persistent issues. Evidence presented included nutritional audits, inspector findings, and first-hand inmate testimonies. While officials often emphasized compliance with minimum caloric standards and safety regulations, the repeated reports of poor quality meals and health impacts highlighted a gap between policy and lived experience. News outlets frequently contrasted these assurances with photographic evidence of substandard meals, reinforcing public concern. Advocacy groups also highlighted the disproportionate impact of inadequate meals on vulnerable populations. Elderly inmates, those with chronic illnesses, and long-term prisoners were most affected by nutrient deficiencies. Interviews collected for reports revealed the physical toll: chronic fatigue, digestive disorders, and slower recovery from minor illnesses. Psychologically, inmates reported demoralization, stress, and frustration, feelings intensified by the visibility of reform promises that often failed to materialize. The media coverage amplified these human stories, making the abstract systemic failures tangible to the public. HMP Liverpool offered a particularly compelling case study. National news outlets documented the reuse of frozen sauces, repeated reheating of protein portions, and limited access to fresh produce. While these practices were partly driven by operational necessity, the public perception was one of neglect and disregard for human dignity. Advocates leveraged this coverage to press for budget increases, kitchen modernization, and staff training improvement. Reports indicated modest progress in some facilities, but inspectors emphasized that systemic reform remained incomplete. The media also played a crucial role in exposing transparency issues. Freedom of information requests, investigative journalism, and undercover reporting revealed discrepancies between official records and actual practices in prisons. For example, while menus were reported to meet nutritional standards on paper, inspections and inmate testimonies consistently contradicted these claims. The public exposure of this gap placed additional pressure on authorities, forcing acknowledgement of long-standing operational failures and prompting discussions about policy revision. Journalistic investigations often highlighted creative inmate adaptations as well, documenting how prisoners supplemented poor meals using commissary items or trades within wings. These stories emphasized resilience and ingenuity, while also underscoring systemic inadequacies. Viewers and readers were confronted with both the failures of the system and the human capacity to adapt, creating a compelling narrative that fueled calls for reform. By evening, as the last trays were cleared from the dining hall at HMP Manchester, the effects of media scrutiny were palpable. Staff were more aware of oversight, inspectors noted improved adherence to protocols during visits, and prison governors reported temporary boosts in meal quality due to heightened attention. Yet the underlying systemic issues, funding limitations, overcrowding, and aging infrastructure persisted. Media coverage and advocacy had raised awareness, but substantive, long-term reform remained an ongoing challenge. The chapter closes with a sobering insight from a senior advocate. Exposing the problem is just the first step. Real reform requires sustained political will, sufficient funding, and systemic changes. Until these elements align, the daily reality for prisoners, inadequate meals, compromised health, and diminished dignity, will continue. The lasting impact and lessons learned. The halls of HMP Birmingham were quieter now. Evening had settled over the prison, leaving behind the echo of clattering trays and distant footsteps. For years, these corridors had borne witness to the same pattern: trays of watery stews, lumpy porridge, and reheated frozen meals making their rounds across overcrowded wings. The story of prison food in the UK was not just about what was served, it was about the enduring consequences of systemic neglect, austerity policies, and operational pressures that had persisted for decades. Inspectors from Inspectorate of Prisons had consistently documented the consequences. Reports highlighted chronic nutrient deficiencies, digestive problems, and fatigue among inmates, particularly affecting the elderly and medically vulnerable. According to the Prison Reform Trust, the psychological impact was equally significant. Inmates reported feelings of demoralization, humiliation, and a persistent sense of neglect. The repetitive, unpalatable meals had become a daily reminder of the limitations and failures of the system, reinforcing the idea that human dignity had often been overlooked behind bars. Advocacy groups, investigative journalists, and parliamentary committees had played a critical role in bringing these issues to light. Documented interviews with former inmates illustrated both the challenges and resilience of those navigating inadequate nutrition. Media coverage amplified their voices, creating pressure on policymakers to implement reforms. Pilot programs introducing fresh produce, diversified menus, and targeted nutrition for vulnerable prisoners offered glimpses of potential change. Yet, inspector reports emphasized that these were incremental improvements rather than systemic solutions, and the majority of prisons continued to face challenges rooted in overcrowding, underfunding, and aging infrastructure. The systemic causes were clear: austerity-driven budget cuts, reliance on bulk prepackaged meals, staff shortages, and outdated kitchen equipment had collectively created an environment where poor nutrition persisted despite repeated inspections and recommendations. The Ministry of Justice and Prison Management faced a persistent dilemma: how to balance operational efficiency, security, and basic nutritional standards under constrained budget. Reports indicated that while some facilities showed modest improvements, the structural challenges remained deeply entrenched, requiring sustained investment and policy reform. Inmates themselves demonstrated remarkable adaptability. From pooling commissary items to improvising meals, prisoners developed coping mechanisms to mitigate the worst effects of inadequate food. These small acts of agency reflected resilience in the face of systemic neglect. Inspector and advocacy reports consistently highlighted that while these strategies provided temporary relief, they were not substitutes for consistent, nutritious meals. Human dignity, in this sense, remained compromised unless structural issues were addressed. Public awareness, fueled by media coverage, investigative journalism, and advocacy campaigns, had generated some accountability. Parliamentary debates and ministerial inquiries stressed the moral and legal obligation to provide adequate nutrition. Yet, as of the most recent reports, progress was uneven, and many inmates continued to experience meals that failed to meet the standards expected in a modern, developed penal system. The lesson was clear: exposure alone was insufficient. Systemic reform required political will, dedicated funding, and operational restructuring across the prison estate. The lasting impact of poor prison nutrition was evident not only in physical health and psychological well-being, but also in social dynamics within wings. Reports documented that scarcity and low-quality meals often contributed to minor conflicts, resource-based hierarchies, and strained relationships among inmates. While resilience and ingenuity mitigated some effects, they could not fully compensate for structural failures. Inspectors emphasized that addressing these issues required holistic reforms, from procurement and staffing to kitchen modernization and oversight mechanisms. In the final hours of the day, as the prison settled into quiet, the human toll of inadequate nutrition was palpable. Trays were cleared, kitchens closed, and staff prepared for the next day's cycle. For inmates, however, the consequences lingered. Fatigue, malnutrition, frustration, and diminished morale remained constant companions. The cumulative effects of systemic neglect had left an indelible mark on physical health, psychological well-being, and daily experience behind bars. The story closes with a sobering reminder from a senior inspector: prison food is more than sustenance. It is a reflection of how society values human dignity, even for those confined behind bars. Without sustained reform, the consequences of neglect, physical, psychological, and social, will continue to echo through these wings for years to come. Even as minor reforms began to take hold in select institutions, the overarching lesson was unambiguous. The quality of prison meals is inseparable from systemic investment, oversight, and respect for human dignity. The British prison system, despite its advancements, still faced a critical challenge: ensuring that those behind bars are provided not just with calories, but with food that sustains both body and spirit.